Welcome everyone. It's Tuesday, time for our next live sew along. So tonight we're going to be working on block number 27 called Roll the Dice. And we'll talk about that in a second. So guess what time it is? It's the first of the month and it's time to clean your machines. If you haven't done that this month, it's a good habit to get yourself into. Not only that, when I clean my machine, I clean and oil it, and I always put in a new needle. So if you're like I used to be, when you change your needle every time you break it, but that may not be often enough. So needles are a good way to improve your stitches to keep a good fresh needle in your machine. I also, guess what I did since last week? I replaced blades in my rotary cutters. So if you watched last week, you might have seen me struggling trying to find a cutter that would cut. And it doesn't really seem to matter how much you cut, you're going to have to replace the blades. If you cut more, you're going to have to replace them more often. So that also might be a good time to check your blades at the first of the month when you're replacing a needle. Check and see if you need a new blade too. So I replaced my blade and it should work really well tonight. So tonight's block is called Roll the Dice. Now, this is a review for those of you who have been watching for a while. So you may have seen this block before in a different size, because remember, all of the Blockbuster patterns are assorted sizes. And you may not be able to tell this, but this block is like a square on a tilt. I'm going to take them off of my design board here and put them on my green cutting mat so you can actually see there's actually a cream colored background space on the sides of the blocks. This is done with the split Rects tool. It makes this rectangle with a diagonal seam. And I have two blue ones and two red ones in my block. And then it also has a square squared in the center. And the colors in the center match the rectangles in my diamond Rex. So I have two blue corners and two red corners. And we'll talk about how to do that as well. So Tony's monitoring. If you have questions or comment, throw those on there and we'll deal with them as we go. So we're going to start with the square squared. This is also review, just for those of you who might not be as familiar with the square squared tool. And I know there's a glare there. I'm trying to fix it where it won't be so obnoxious. One thing I wanted to point out, this tool has Invisigrip on it. It's a vinyl static cling that just kind of sticks to the back side of the ruler to help keep it firm where it doesn't slip as much. I typically don't use Invisigrip on my tools, but occasionally I'll pick up one here in the shop that somebody else has put Invisigrip on, and so I don't take it off. But we do sell it, and it is something you can peel off and put on all the backs of your rulers that don't have the textured, non-slip surface. Now, I encourage you to mark on your rulers information that helps you. And I put on my square squared tool an A for the A section of my tool and a B for the B section of my tool. This is a two-step process. So I start out with the window template that actually precisely cuts the center square for my square and a square. Sometimes you also might hear these called diamond squares, because generally a square and a square is on point. If you're not talking about an economy block where you have a double square and a square, or even a triple square and a square, a single square and a square sometimes is referred to as a diamond square because it's got an on-point square in the middle. And so on this A end of my tool, I have a window template here that I'm going to use for the center square. There's also a chart here on the side that tells me what size squares I need to get the finished size that I want. And those squares are cut in half to make an oversized triangle. Now, that being said, the information you need for making this roll the dice block is in the handouts that you'll get, and along with the instructions for the block as well. So we're going to start out. This is a 4-inch finished unit. So on my tool, I have an area that it tells me this is my center square for my 4-inch finished block. So I have my gold square over here. Let me grab it. And I'm going to put that underneath my tool. And I just want to square up that square so I know it's precisely the right size. The thing about square a square is it's an odd size that you have to cut. So you don't have to do the math using this tool. You just follow this window template because you're actually after the measurement of this center square, measuring from point to point, and then you have to add the seam allowance to that. So sometimes that's a really ugly number. So all I have to do is just use that window template, cut exactly the size I need, and I'm ready to start stitching. Now for the side triangles, I have the chart for a 4-inch finished unit. It tells me I need a 3 1/4 inch square. I'm going to take that square and just cut it corner to corner. And that gives me 2 triangles. And I do that with both colors. I forgot to say one thing about your tool. If you have the newer updated tool, which most of you probably do, it has on this window template what size strips to start with for that center square. So for a 4-inch finished block, it tells me to cut this from a 3 1/2 inch strip. Now, of course, I only need one, so I just used a square instead of a strip. But if I'm making a bunch of these in this size, I would just cut a 3 1/2 inch strip, and I would go along my strip cutting the squares in the exact size that I need. So I'm ready to stitch. I'm going to take this to this needle camera so you can see the process to stitch it on. So let's back out and see if we can get this thing to focus. We'll talk for a minute while it tries to focus. So I want to make sure that when I put these together, I haven't done it yet. It was being contrary earlier. Let me put my hand there. Maybe it'll focus on my hand. Just tells me, there we go. Just tells me I need lotion. Okay, so I want to put my 2 red triangles on opposite sides, and then I'll put my blue triangles on opposite sides as well. So one thing that is a little different about putting together our square and a square unit using our square squared tool, I want to sew with the square on top. Typically, in the past, when I've made this unit, I would put the triangle on top and stitch. Since this center square is cut precisely to the size it needs to be, I want to put it on top so I can see it, and I want to make sure that I'm stitching a 1/4 inch from the edge. I also want to have about an equal amount of ears sticking out on both sides because those are going to get trimmed, and I'm just wanting to center that on there. You might have seen instructions that told you to fold the triangle in half and pinch and fold the square in half and pinch and then match them up. You really don't have to be that fussy with this. You just want to center it on that side, and then you're going to use whatever your 1/4 inch measurement is to stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge of my square. And then I'm going to just grab my fabric tag and park my needle. Usually when I clean my machine and get a new needle, I also get a new fabric tag. I didn't this time, I don't know why, but it is well used. Now I'm going to put the other red triangle on the opposite side, and I'm going to stitch that on. Again, I'm putting the square on top where I can see really well what I'm doing. And I'm just going to stitch right along. I'm using the edge of my presser foot as my guide to stitch my 1/4 inch. And I'm going to grab my fabric tag and park my needle. So now your next step is to flip back those triangles on the 2 red triangles that I put on, and I'm just going to give it a quick little finger press. Notice when I finger press, I'm doing little short motions. I don't want to start on this side and just rip all the way down to the other side because I can skew that bias edge of my triangle. and then my whole unit can be distorted. So I just kind of take about a 1/2 inch stroke at a time, and that will make those seams lay flat the way I want them to. Now this is the 2 blue triangles, they're going on next, but again, I want the triangle on bottom, the square on top, and I'm just going to center it on there, just eyeball it. You don't have to be real fussy with it, and I'm going to stitch it on. Now, by the way, if you don't flip back the first triangles before you add this triangle, you're going to be needing your seam ripper, because you have to flip back your first triangle so that you won't trap them down. So if you're making a bunch of these, I would assembly line sew them. Since I'm just needing one, I'm just taking my fabric tag and parking my needle each time. This is the last triangle I'm going to add. Some sizes, the triangles overlap and you have to be careful that you don't stitch down the tip. This size, you don't have that problem. But I'm just going to center that on there, and I'm going to stitch right along the edge of that square. Notice it's not lined up right here, but once I get my needle down, I sew with my needle in the down position. So every time the needle stops, it stops in the fabric and I can adjust in front of the needle, and that just makes life easier. So now I have my 4 oversized triangles added to my center square, and I'm ready to go to the ironing surface and trim. So let me show you what that'll look like. So here is my pressing mat, and I'm just going to give these triangles a quick finger press. And notice, if you watch me press, you're going to notice most of the time I give it a quick little finger press, because that way I can be assured that my seams are going the way I want them to go before I ever put heat to my unit. And so if you're using the Acorn pressing pin, just give it a quick little swipe on all 4 seams, and that will flatten out your seams really nicely. Once you get that done, you're ready to trim. So let's talk about what that process looks like. This side of the tool is the side I'm going to use to trim, the B side, and that's where I marked it. If by chance you're using the large square squared, it will trim up to a 12-inch block. It will also trim this 4-inch block, but it's actually 2 separate pieces of plastic, and they are marked A and B for you. So all I have to do now is find all the X's with the size I'm finishing with. So this is a 4-inch finished unit. I'm going to find all the X's that say 4, and those X's go right on the intersections. Once I get those in place, I just kind of tweak the tool till it's right on top of my seams. If I'm right-handed, I'm going to have my tool sideways like this, and I'm going to trim up the short side of the tool and across the top. If you're left-handed, just simply turn the tool this way so that you're trimming up the long side of the tool first and across the top. I'm not going to try that. I'm going to go back to my right-handed placement. There are good computer graphics of how to lay your ruler to get these seams where you need them to be, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. So since this is a finished 4-inch unit, I need to trim it to 4.5 inches. So I have lines right here. That's my trim up lines, and I'm going to place those lines, the 4.5-inch line, on my cut edges. And then I'm also going to check and make sure those intersections that say 4 land on top of my intersections. And I'm going to trim up and over, and I have a perfectly trimmed center unit for my block. So that's how you go about getting your center unit. Let's talk about the split Rects unit, the tool, and all of that. So again, I encourage you to mark lines on your tool that are helpful to you. This one, I don't know if you can see it, but I put a red line right across there. This long diagonal line, it says it's the common diagonal seam line. And you're going to be using that in the process of making the units. Now, first of all, we've got a direction, I guess is the best way to say this. I want to make sure that when I cut my pieces, my seam leans the way I want it to, because I can cut it so that my seams lean the opposite way. On all of my seams for this particular block, the seam needs to lean from the top left of the unit down to the bottom right. And that's with the unit vertical like this. So in order to do that, I need to make sure all of my pieces that I'm cutting are face up underneath my tool here. So I've got a red rectangle and a blue rectangle, and I'm going to just stack them because I can cut them both at the same time. And on my tool, it tells me for the size finished unit I want, what size strip I need. So this is what I'm measuring, a 9-inch strip in order to get a 4x8 unit. And I just cut a chunk big enough that I can get two split Rects that are blue and two split Rects that are red. So I've got my blue underneath my red. I've got both of them face up. If I put one of them face down, I'm going to end up with a mirror image. So I don't want to do that. And I'm just going to line up the bold solid line. It says place on edge of strip. And that's what I'm doing. My strip just isn't very long. And I'm going to make a diagonal cut along that diagonal edge of the tool. So there are two split Rex triangles. Now I'm just going to twist all the way around. That long common diagonal that I marked with red, and it tells me that's my second trim guideline, that's going to go on that diagonal edge. And I also have a tiny little mark down here that says second trim. That goes on the base of my strip. Once I get this in place, then I would cut again. Now, if I'm making a bunch of these, I might have a 9-inch strip cut across the width of the fabric, and I could go back and forth. Let me see if I can do it this way. Tony said I might want to slide it down. That I don't know why that glare has showed up again, but it has. So now I have two red and two blue side triangles to go in my split Rex units. So I also need background triangles. So it's sometimes if you are making something that has a mirror image, that means one seam would lean from the top left down to the bottom right, one seam would lean this way. Then you would make sure that you put your strip face to face or back to back. So you have a double strip and you get a mirror image. But since all of my split Rex need to lean the same way, I have taken care to stack my rectangles. You may not be able to see it, but I've got all of them face up, pretty side up. And again, I'm going to line up that bold solid line on the edge. And this 4x8 line right here is going to line up on the bottom. And I'm going to make a cut. Then I'm just going to twist all the way around. My red line is going to line up on that cut edge. My second trim line is going to end up right here on the bottom. And I'm going to make another cut. So now there I have four triangles, four side triangles, two to go with the blue and two to go with the red. So let's go to the sewing surface and we'll walk through the process of making split Rex units. So if you have ever sewn this split rectangle unit in some other way, you're going to find that this is an easier way to make sure that you get your seams where they need to be. You end up with the seam allowance in the right place for sewing them together for the next one. This one may be kind of a challenge because it's such a big unit. I'm going to just move my camera out so you can see a little better what I'm stitching. So when you get ready to stitch this, you want to lay this so you can actually see a rectangle before you start sewing anything. If this was a solid fabric and I ended up placing it that way, I have room to stitch that, but it will never trim into the rectangle I want. So you want to just give it a glance before you stitch it, and you just center those two seams. I try to make sure I have a little bit of an ear sticking out on this end, and I have about an equal amount of a little ear sticking out on the bottom end. And I'm just eyeballing that. I don't have to be fussy with it. This one, let me turn it around so you can see there's just a little bit of an ear there, and there's a little bit of an ear there. That gives me the wiggle room I'm going to need so that when I get ready to trim, I can make sure that I get it trimmed up properly. And I'm just aligning those two long diagonal edges, and I'm sewing off of my fabric tag onto my triangles. Now you won't have to be working around a camera probably. So you're just going to stitch right down the edge. Got to get over here where I can see the edge. It's not so bad when you're doing a smaller one, but when I'm doing these bigger units for you to be able to see it, I kind of have to move my camera where you can get to it. So the same thing, and notice this time I have my cream colored on the left and my blue on the right. It absolutely doesn't matter. If I turn this around, it's going to be the same angle, which is what I'm after. So whichever one you are comfortable with sewing on top, this particular unit, it doesn't matter what goes on top because you've got a bias edge along that long edge on both pieces. So let's go around my camera here. And I'm just aligning these edges as I go. If you feel the need to pin, you certainly could. You could also use seam-aligned glue. I have some, and occasionally, depending on what I'm stitching, I use it to pin based, and it makes life easier sometimes. So it doesn't matter whether I stitch with the blue on top or the cream on top. Because of the way I cut, it's automatically going to be the right arrangement of that seam. And I'm just making sure I have that little ear sticking out up there before I get started stitching. And I think you should all get a camera and put it in front of your sewing machine and try sewing that way. Oh, Tony says I should have a little band attached to my head. I know, a GoPro camera. I'd probably mess it up somehow. All right, so my last one, I have my red and my cream color, and I'm going to line that up. And of course, you may be using completely different colors. You don't have to stick with the color arrangement that I have because there's several different ways to stitch the block. Um, a couple of projects ago, we did a big sampler called Fundamental Sampler, and we used this roll of the dice block, but I think they were 9-inch units, maybe 8-inch units. They weren't 12, I know that. And so now I've got all of those stitched. Let me grab my fabric tag. And it looks like we've got our Florida people here and several local people here. So it's always nice to see who's joining us. And so we're just going to cut these apart real quick and we're ready to go to the ironing surface and the trimming surface. And we'll talk about what you look for and how to trim. So I have, let me get rid of my design board because I don't need it anymore right now. I've got my split Rex units, and I like to press this one toward my darker fabric. You could also press this open, but on the ones that I've made ahead of time, I've pressed toward the darker fabric, and I'm just going to give it a quick little finger press. That way it makes sure that the seam allowance is laying the way it's supposed to, and generally, I take all of them and kind of stack them. I kind of stagger them, I guess is the best way to say it, and stack them so that I can finger press all of them. I do that while my iron is heating up because most of you probably have irons that shut off when you sit down and then you stand up to iron and they're not hot or they're not as hot as you want them to be. So this gives your iron time to heat back up and gives you time to get all of your seam allowances going the right way. Then you're ready to just set the iron on it. Let the iron do the work. So I'm just going to pick one up, add it to the list or to the stack, and I'm going to do that with all 4 of my units. And again, if you're going to use the acorn pressing pin, this is when you would grab it. And typically, I would do a couple of them at a time. I just put a little swipe of that on, put another one on, and while that is under the iron, I just do the other 2. Doesn't take a lot, just enough to kind of give it a little bit of help. And you may or may not see the liquid that's in the acorn pressing pin. If you don't see it, it does not mean you don't have some on there. It works really well and it doesn't take a lot. All right, so I'm ready to trim these. Now again, there are different directions for right hand or left hand use. If you're right hand, you're going to point this angled side toward you. This short side here on the right side is going to be the first side you cut, and then you're going to cut across the long side like that. So I'll cut one, and then I'll talk about how you would place your tool if you're left-handed. All I have to do is line up that long common diagonal on this seam and just slide it until I can see just a tiny space all the way around the rectangle of the size I'm making. So this is a 4.5 by 8.5 inch cut size. It's going to finish 4 by 8. And notice I have just a tiny sliver all the way around that 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangle. And I can cut up the short side, across the long side. Oh, this is so much easier than last week when I was trying to do this with a dull cutter. We tried every cutter here. None of them would make me happy, but now I'm happy. So now the 8.5 inch line and the 4.5 inch line go right there on our cut edges. Again, I'm going to put that long common diagonal on that seam and cut up the short side, across the long side. Now I want you to notice something with this split Rex unit. It has a little flat spot on both ends. If you don't have that, it will not sew properly into the next seam and you'll chop off your points. So that's the purpose of having a tool, so that it lines up perfectly and you get the exact amount of a little flat edge there that you need. So if you're left-handed, simply turn your unit vertical. You're going to use that same long common diagonal, but this time you're going to cut up the long side first, and we're just going to line that up and just slide the tool with the long common diagonal line on the seam. Slide the tool into place so that you have a sliver to trim away all the way around the outside. So you're going to cut up the long side, across the top. I don't have the nerve to try that, so we're going to go this way. We're going to line up the long common diagonal, slide it so we give ourselves room to get all the way around. We're going to go up and over. Then I'm going to turn 180 degrees and see it's automatically making the little flat edge there that I need on the corner. And that makes it where it lines up properly on our project. So we have 2 properly trimmed split Rex units. And I'm going to not take the time to trim the other 2 because I want to show you how to assemble this block. So let's take, I'll get our design board back. So I've got my unit here. And I had this on here when we started. I had a different arrangement, I think is what it was. I had the red, that one hasn't been trimmed. That would not work well. So I've got, and that one hasn't been trimmed either. Those were the 2 that I didn't trim. So there is an arrangement of my roll the dice block. So we're going to do a technique called the unfinished seam technique. Now, before I do that, I will tell you, you don't have to arrange it this way. You don't have to arrange the colors this way. You could even turn these around and put the cream colored on the inside. So it would create kind of a wonky square inside of a square. And you would still have the colors to show off. This would even be a fun place to do some quilting that really shows up nicely. So you don't have to do the arrangement that's in your pattern. So let me turn this back around because I am going to do this arrangement. So a partial seam technique or an unfinished seam technique means that I'm going to start stitching on one of my seams. I'm going to start on this one right here. I'm just going to move this over. And I will start stitching and stitch about halfway across this center square. And then I'm going to add this seam next and stitch all the way across, and then add this seam next, stitch all the way across, and then add this seam next, stitch all the way across, then I complete that first seam. So that's why it's called partial seam or an unfinished seam technique. It's a really cool technique to use. It gives you kind of a different look. So I'm going to start by stitching here. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing surface so you can see what I'm doing. Any questions? I see a lot of people. Oh, Marty's going to be blowing this way soon. That means that it's windy there. It's fairly windy here too, but not like a couple of weeks ago I was in Kansas for a quilting thing, and the wind was blowing about 35 or 40 miles an hour, and it was intense. Okay, so I've got my two pieces. I want to start on the corner that needs to match up. Let me back out. This may have to go over my shoulder or something, but I only want to stitch halfway across this center square. So I'm just going to flip it over. If you feel the need to pin, you could. I don't see a real reason to pin because I'm going to match up this corner. I'm going to stitch past that seam. There's an intersection there. Let me see if I can mark it so you can see what I'm looking at. I want to stitch past that intersection where those two lines cross. See the stitching lines? You can see what I drew on there. This is the seam that sewed the red triangle on, and this is the seam that sewed the blue triangle on. Where it intersects, I want my seam to come across there. And if I've trimmed properly, that's 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So that's where I'm headed. I'm going to stitch there, and I'm going to not pin. If you feel the need to pin, certainly go ahead. If you struggle with keeping the edges together as you start stitching, it may be a good idea for you, but I'm aiming for that intersection right there. And once I get that stitched, I'm going to, I think I'll just back up a couple of stitches, and I'm going to cut. Now you have options. At this point, you've got to press. You can either press toward the square, you can press away from the square, you could even press open. I'm going to press away from the square, and here's why. I have all of this bulk on this intersection here where the square squared is, and I want to press away from that. So I'm just going to give it a quick little finger press right there. And notice there's no seam right there. So I'm just pressing down to about where that intersection is. Once I get that done, I can put on my blue split Rex unit, and it goes all the way across. Now here's a good test for you. If this is not the same size, you've got a problem, because using your precisely trimmed square squared and your precisely trimmed split Rex and putting it next to the next size, the next split Rex, they should match. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm just going to, I think I'm going to go this way so I can see all my seams. I want to, again, hit that intersection when I stitch. And after that first time when I got that first partial seam, I am going to pin just to kind of help control things. I don't have anything here that I have to really match to. Sometimes I've got pieced units on this big rectangle that I've got to match those seams. I don't really have anything, but I want to make sure that they lay down and I don't have to fight seam allowances. Now when I get to this corner, it's an odd corner because the seam does not come directly into the corner. But I want to stitch 1/4 of an inch from the edge here and 1/4 of an inch from the edge here going this way, and it's going to be right about there. And if I have trimmed properly, that's going to line up exactly, let me see if I can poke it over, right on the seam on the other side, and it does. Let me see if it'll focus. Sometimes if I get too close to it, it just doesn't want to focus. So we're just going to put a pin there. You can also, there's a couple of things you could do. You could mark that if you're worried. I don't worry about it because I seem to be able to hit it pretty good. But something else that you may not have noticed on my machine, this is a piece of painter's tape that's trimmed to 1/4 of an inch. That's also a good test. If you glance at that, it's 1/4 of an inch from this edge to where my pin is inserted. If I turn it this way, it should also be 1/4 of an inch to about where the pin is inserted. So I have that on my machine just kind of as a good visual guide, and it's a good way of testing to make sure that you're stitching the right seam allowance. So we're just going to go right on over. Now we're going to stitch off of our fabric tag onto our center square, and I want to hit that intersection where those two seams connect. And I sewed with thread that matches so well to my gold that you can't see it, but I'm just stitching right along the edge using a 1/4 inch seam. Now where I inserted this pin, I know that's about my 1/4 inch seam, but if you're worried, you could always measure it. There are little tools you can use to do that, but I'm just going to stitch right off of that and we'll see how we do. So I am going to grab my fabric tag, stitch off of my seam onto my fabric tag, because now I've got the first seam sewn. Notice I didn't have to go just halfway. I got to go all the way across. This one I want to again press away from this center square. So I'm just going to give it a quick little finger press, and looky there. I'm pretty close. If it bugs you, now's the time to fix it. I could have been just a little closer with the blue side of this, and I figure it's close enough for government work right now, so I'm not going to take the time to fix it. But if it worries you, now's the time to fix it. So next comes my other red rectangle. I'm going to flip it over on here, but I need to stitch from the other side so I can see that intersection. I'm going to line up my corners, and I'm just letting it kind of fall where it falls. Let's see if we can get a little closer with this one. Okay, so here is my intersection. There's a 1/4 inch. And when I'm on the other side, let me peel this back because I went too far. And I just kind of wiggle it into place till I can feel the seams lock. There are tricks you can do. You could press open and you could see that intersection a little better. For most of what I'm doing on this, it's not going to be a problem, so I'm not going to worry about it. But if it worries you, you could certainly mark it with some sort of marking tool so that you hit that exactly. But that's where there might be an issue if there's going to be one. So I'm just going to stitch right onto that intersection. So let's get our fabric tag. There are a lot of really cool blocks that use this unfinished seam technique. Some of them are pieced rectangles, some of them are plain rectangles, but it's an easy way to add what you're after. See, that one I was better. I got that once it's pressed, my red and my blue meet exactly. There is a cream dot on the red fabric, or a gold dot, that almost camouflages the end. So let me show you what you can do when you got an issue like that. If it worries you and you think you're not going to be able to see that you did a really good job, this may not be the right color pin, but look what you can do if you have an area like that that is making it look like you didn't quite meet where you needed to meet. This is my permanent gel pen, so you want to be careful with a permanent pen because you could ruin that and have to fix it. But that gives it even more a precise point. Just little tricks. It's all smoke and mirrors, you know. So now I'm on the last split rectangle. So there's where it goes. See, I told you I'd tell you a bunch of tricks that you had never thought of. I don't remember if it was a class. I think it was a class a couple of months ago that I got a pin out and marked the center of something to camouflage just a thread or two off. Sometimes you have to do that, but you have to be careful because, first of all, you don't want to use a friction pen because once you press it, guess what? That mark disappears. And if you use a permanent pen that bleeds, you could cause yourself a problem, and then you're having to take the units out and replace them. So now here's my next. I get to do the whole seam this time. And there's that partial seam that I started with. I'm just going to kind of peel it back out of my way so I don't have to fuss with it and fight it, because I'm going to stitch all the way across. Start here, and I just kind of ease the edges together as I go. I'm looking for the intersection between the two lines of stitching, and I always adjust as I go. And once I get to here, let me grab my fabric tag. By the way, if you don't remember what my little board is that I put my fabric on as I am planning and deciding which way I'm going to assemble my block, that one was pretty good too. So we're just going to finger press that. This is a piece of foam core poster board covered with a piece of flannel, just glued on there with a glue stick. So it gives a good way of having something that you can put your block on and move the fabric around with a little bit of flannel or fleece or batting. It helps everything stick to it. So now I've got all of my whole seams and I'm ready to go back and finish that partial seam that I started with. So all I have to do is flip this over, match up the corner, because I've already gone past this intersection that I've been looking for, and I'm just matching up the corner. I'm going to give it a little pin. And again, you can measure and mark the 1/4 inch, and you're going a 1/4 inch from this edge and a 1/4 inch from this edge. And where it meets, if you've got it placed perfectly, it'll meet the seam on the other side. So I'm just going to pin that in place. And this time I'm going to start in the middle of that seam where I stopped the first time. So I'm going to grab my fabric tag and just pull it out of the way, set my needle down, and I'm ready to stitch. And now as I go, I make sure that I'm aligned here on the edge. So just stitch that on. Let's get rid of our fabric tag because we don't need it right now. And I'm headed for that pin for that 1/4 inch edge. And once you get that in place, grab your fabric tag and park your needle. And you're done with the block. It's not a block that takes a real long time. And again, I'm going to be pressing away from the center square. So let's go to the ironing surface so you can see kind of what that looks like. So I will still finger press the seams so they'll lay the way I want them to lay. This is the one that I marked with a marker to cover up that little gold fleck where it looked like I hadn't met the point. And I'm going away from the center, so I'm pressing toward the rectangle every time. This one I could match up a little tighter, but I'm not going to worry about it. So now I'm going to finger press this. And again, you could also press open. I'm not going to, but you could. So once you get your finger pressing done, just set the iron on there and let the iron do the work. So it lays down really nice and flat around the center square. It's kind of camouflaged. You don't really notice those seams at a glance to notice there's a seam right here that connects that little bit of blue that's in that center square. So there is a roll the dice block. This is where you would use a little acorn pressing solution, and I would just give it a quick little swipe down those 4 seams, and that is a partial seam technique. It's a fun thing to do. So next week we'll be adding the next installment of our blockbusters, and if you've noticed behind me, I've put blocks up from the last 4 or 5 lessons. So let me come back over here and I'll turn the other camera on so maybe you can see. Some of them are up higher than you can see. They are. There's actually 3 or 4 blocks up there above. So if you come in the shop, look on the board behind my sewing machine so you can see some of the blocks that we're doing. Before long, I'll have a new schedule for some classes. We'll do the Morning Star quilt again, and we will do the Feathered Star, not the tiny one that's behind me over here. We'll do a 28-inch block so that you can try out that technique. It's a fun block to do. So any questions that anybody had? Okay, so next time we'll be doing the next block. And remember, we do skip a few of them if they don't fit within a 12-inch block, or if they use the specialty star tools, because I use those and we do classes with those. They need just a little more time than a 30 or 45-minute video would be. So until then, happy sewing. Come and see us when you have